Hello there. In this video, I want to demonstrate to you why we can believe the resurrection of Jesus really happened. There are logical, reasonable pieces of evidence that we can put together that give us a strong and compelling argument to say that Jesus Christ really did rise from the dead, and therefore it is a totally rational and sensible thing to pin our hopes and our faith on that event. And the pieces of evidence I want us to consider this evening, there's quite a lot of evidence. We only have a short amount of time, so we'll only consider a few of the really key pieces. But they are as follows. We're going to consider the evidence of the empty tomb. We're going to consider the witness of the disciples. We're going to consider Paul's conversion. And we're going to consider James's conversion. And now Paul and James there being two particular witnesses who stand out a little bit above the others, and we'll appreciate why that is when we get to them. But first of all, the empty tomb. Now, the situation is as follows. Jesus was buried in a known tomb. So he was put to death, he was crucified, and when they were certain he was dead, he was placed in a tomb, and everyone knew where he was. Not long after this, people started to claim that Jesus rose from the dead and was, actively doing things. And it wasn't just a few people who claimed this. This was something that spread very quickly throughout the Roman Empire, and therefore somewhat angered the Romans at the time, who didn't like this new belief spreading throughout their empire, and of course angered the Jewish authorities, who had been the ones to put Jesus to death in the first place. And so these were people who really wanted to stop this movement. And the most effective way to stop the movement, the Christian movement, would have been to present the body of Jesus. If the Roman authorities or the Jewish authorities could have brought forth the body of Jesus and shown it to people, it would immediately have stopped the rumor that Jesus rose from the dead, because evidently he was still dead. However, we know for certain that that didn't happen, because we're still talking about it 2,000 years later. That means no one could produce the body. There were a great many people who wanted to stop the Christian movement. None of them were able to produce a body which would have been very effective in doing so. We can therefore conclude it wasn't in the tomb, because of course the tomb was a known tomb. People knew where the body should have been. People could go to the tomb where the body would have been if there was a body there. And as no one could produce the body despite the tomb being a known tomb, the tomb had to be empty. And of course, that raises the big and obvious question, well, who emptied it? Who moved the body of Jesus after he was crucified? Well, let's think about some of the likely candidates. Firstly, the Pharisees. They were the people who had put Jesus to death in the first place. But there's a few problems with them moving the body. Firstly, they don't really have any particular reason to want to move the body. They knew where it was nice and secure, it was under guard. That's an excellent place for the body to be. And then, if they did move the body, they would still have the body and would have been able to present it later on when people were claiming he rose from the dead. So the fact that they couldn't later on present the body somewhat stops the idea that it could have been the Pharisees. Perhaps the next most obvious candidates are the Romans. Again, they would have the capacity, certainly, to go to the tomb and remove anything from it, so that they had the means. But again, they have absolutely no motive to do so. Why would they want to move a body of someone who to them was not that important at the time? And again, the same problem arises of later on, when people are claiming that Jesus rose from the dead. Had the Romans moved the body, they would have been able to present that moved body and show that it was Jesus, and it would have again stopped this claim. So that perhaps then the final option would be the disciples. Maybe the disciples moved the body. Jesus claimed he would rise from the dead, so the disciples moved the body so that the claim has credit. Well, it's not a bad idea in a way, except the disciples possibly don't have the means. If the body is under guard and in a tomb like that with an enormous stone guarding it, well, not guarding it, covering it, then it would be very difficult for the disciples to subtly go along and steal the body away. And probably more importantly is their motive as well. Okay, Jesus claimed that he would raise from the dead, and the disciples believed him, but they'd stop believing in him if they moved his body. And these disciples were then willing to go and tell people he rose from the dead, but they didn't gain anything from it. When they were telling everyone they met that they knew that Jesus rose from the dead, they weren't doing it to gain power or riches or money or anything. They were doing it because they wanted to tell people. If they knew it was a lie, then either they'd have been trying to extort people, which they weren't, or they would have stopped telling their lie when things got really difficult for them and they were being persecuted. That's when you would say, okay, fine, I moved the body. The fact they didn't do that gives us great evidence to suggest that they didn't move the body. Now, that's a very quick look at three of the more obvious options. Other people have gone into a great deal more depth into who possibly could have moved the body of Jesus. And no one has found a good answer. The common answer that people come to is it is impossible for the body of Jesus to have moved unless it moved on its own, as in the resurrection story is an accurate account and Jesus really did rise from the dead. So that's the first piece of evidence, the empty tomb. The second piece of evidence, we've sort of alluded to already with the disciples, is the witness evidence. So these are people who claim that they had seen the raised Jesus. Now, when I say there were people who claim to have seen it, you might think, okay, his disciples did. But his disciples are perhaps more numerous than you might first think. In 1 Corinthians 15, this is what Paul has to say about people who've seen Jesus. He says there that he, that's Jesus, was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas, that's known as Peter, then to the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. 500 people, that's a lot of people. And he says most of them are still alive because he's telling you, these are people you can go and speak to. I'm not just saying that there's 500 people, but never contact them. He's saying there's 500 people, go and find them and say, what did you see? You say you've seen the risen Jesus Christ. Tell me about it. Tell me what you saw. And then not only that, you can then corroborate. Does their story match up? These 500 people, do they all actually see the same thing? Paul certainly seems to think so. Now, 500 people, I've drawn that out for you. No, I've not drawn that out. There's what 500 stick figures looks like. It's a lot of people. If you wanted to know where I was a week last Wednesday and 500 people say, I saw him in Wakefield train station, then you can be pretty confident I was in Wakefield train station the week last Thursday. Yeah, 500 witnesses is a lot of people to all claim to have seen the same thing. And let me just reiterate what we said before. These are people who aren't just saying, yeah, I think I saw him. These are people who are willing to die on that claim. They're willing to be put to death because they say they've seen him. If they were uncertain, if they were, lying, if they were making it up, then the threat of torture and death for the vast majority of people would be more than enough to say, no, okay, no, I didn't see him. But these are people who were so convinced, so adamant that they had seen the risen Lord Jesus, they were willing to suffer terribly and die to spread that word. And that is something I think that would only happen if these people really did see what they claimed and were telling the truth. Now, of these witnesses, these disciples who claim to have seen the risen Jesus, some of them stand out to me as more significant witnesses than others. And particularly, I'm thinking now of Paul himself. Now, Paul is well known for being an apostle who wrote several of the letters of the New Testament and was very influential in the spread of the early church and Christianity. However, he didn't always have such a positive influence on Christianity. In his youth, Paul was actually part of the sort of Jewish religious authority of the time and was vehemently against Jesus and against his followers. Here's what he has to say for himself, recalling what he was like as a younger man in Acts 26. Here's what he says. He says, why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things in opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth. I did so in Jerusalem, that's where he was based. I not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priests, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. So he would cast his vote against people, said, put these people to death. So much he hated these followers of Jesus. He would imprison them, put them to death. And he carries on. And I punished them often in all the synagogues and tried to make them blaspheme. He was this against them. And in a raging fury against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. In raging fury, he would not even constrain himself to Jerusalem. He would go out and he would follow and try and get these people and lead them away as prisoners and try and get them put to death. That's how much he hated these followers of Jesus. So why is that important? Well, it's important because let's consider how his conversion gives more evidence to the resurrection of Jesus. And we're going to do that by thinking about an example of sources of information. So let's say you hear a rumor that I have rescued a cat from a tree. That being a cat stuck up a tree, not a cat being attacked by a tree. Now, if you hear this from my bestest friend, who really wants to make me look good, then you might think, well, maybe he's exaggerating. Maybe I just walked past a tree and a cat jumped on me. And my best friend, who wants to make me look good in this situation, is like, he rescued a cat from a tree. Maybe your best friend wouldn't do that for you, but yeah. However, what if it was my absolute worst enemy in the whole world who said, he rescued a cat from a tree? Now, they have no incentive at all to make that story up. They have no reason to try and make me look any better. So if they do say that, if you hear from my absolute worst enemy, he saved a cat from a tree, then you're more likely to believe that that was the thing that actually happened. Because the only reason that person has to say this story is that it's actually the truth. And it's the same with Paul. He went from, he was the absolute worst enemy of Jesus and his followers in his early life. He was determined to go against them, and then he suddenly says, no, this man rose from the dead. And that kind of shift in attitude and that kind of confession from Paul has more weight to it because of his initial hatred. He had no reason to lie. The only reason to make that claim for him was it was actually the truth. And again, Paul is someone who suffered greatly for what he was teaching. He was always trying to preach. And as he was preaching, in 2 Corinthians 11, here's a list of some of the things that happened to him. He was imprisoned. He was 5 times he was whipped. He was beaten with rods 3 times. He was stoned and nearly killed from that stoning. He was shipwrecked 3 times. I should say, these are all things that he lists that happened to him generally. These didn't all happen on one occasion in 2 Corinthians 11. And he goes on to list a great number of other perils and sufferings he faced, including cold and hunger and thirst and other general woes that people might have. He didn't gain anything from it. He didn't gain power. He didn't gain money. He suffered just generally the rest of his life. He'd given up a great career in the Jewish religious leadership to become a preacher of Jesus Christ. And you've got to ask yourself, well, what happened between those 2 events? What happened to make him go from someone who hated Jesus' followers to one of their biggest, members? And it was that he was convinced the resurrection of Jesus was an actual thing that happened. And if it was convincing enough for him, then I find it quite compelling for me. On a related note, but slightly different, is James. Now, James was the brother of Jesus. So you might initially think, well, if he was his brother, he was probably on his side from the get-go. However, if we look in the Gospels, we'll find that's not quite the case. John 7 tells us that even his brothers, not even his brothers, believed in him. So his own brothers didn't believe that Jesus was anything particularly special. And in fact, elsewhere, we're told that his family thought that he was mad. So they didn't follow him then. But later on, again, it's words from Paul here that we're going to consider. He says, I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. This is Paul referring to a time between his going against Jesus to going for Jesus, where he came across the apostle James there. Notice he's now an important key figure in preaching the gospel. And if you read in Acts, you'll find that James becomes very influential in the church at Jerusalem. He's a very important figure. He helps to establish it and keep it secure. He's described as a pillar of the church. So here's a man who goes not from complete hatred, but from, apathy, perhaps we could say, of Jesus. He didn't really want to be involved with this movement, to becoming a really key part of it. And the only thing that changes between those 2 events is Jesus rose from the dead. And it was enough to convince James. So that's where we're going to finish. Here's so where we round up. This is what we've thought of. We've thought of the tomb, the empty tomb. The fact that the tomb was empty meant that the authorities of the day, both Jewish and Roman, were unable to produce a body that could have stopped the spread of Christianity. And the lack of people available to have moved that body leaves us to conclude, perhaps, that Jesus moved himself because he rose from the dead. Then we have over 500 witnesses who then claim to have seen the risen Jesus. And bear in mind, they didn't gain anything from it. Quite the opposite. Most of them suffered horrible deaths, but were willing to do so because they were determined to tell people. They were like, I must tell people Jesus rose from the dead, and I'm willing to die for that claim. That's not the claim of people who have been semi-convinced, who are unsure, who maybe sort of thing, or who are just outright lying. This is the claim of people who have it certain in their minds Jesus rose from the dead. And from that, Paul and James are two particularly key figures. Paul, because of his previous hatred, that makes him a very reliable source on this subject. And James, who again was not filled with hatred, but was apathetic. Now, one of the important things about all these is that they sort of all add together. If there was only one piece of evidence, if it was just the empty tomb, maybe we could say, well, there's some other factor we've not thought of that's lost to time, which would explain it. But you have to do that for all of these different points. And there are others as well. Some people look at other bits of evidence, like the fact that it was in Jerusalem. Some people find this compelling evidence on its own. And you can look into all these other pieces of evidence because there's a lot more to look at here. This has only been a short video. And of course, this all meshes together with previous evidence that we've considered about the reliability of the Bible in general, in more general terms. And slowly but surely, hopefully, we're showing that all these pieces of evidence, they do come together and give us a very sure, firm hope that the foundations of our faith are not whimsical, but they have a real, logical, reliable, rational basis. And that's a wonderful thing to pin your hope onto. Thank you for listening.